This lecture is on the three phases of decision making. And this represents one general approach to designing a process for decision making. It's not the only way to do it, but I find that it's very helpful because it breaks the cognitive processes down into distinct chunks. I even use an approach like this when I'm making decisions on my own. I kind of write everything out as if I were following this process. And it's a way of taking a huge, seemingly intractable or overwhelming problem and breaking it down into a process that we can follow through to get where we need to be. So the general approach is that we break decision making into three phases. Sense making, which is about defining the problem, and it's focused really on the past. What happened yesterday? How have things looked? Um, the second phase is agenda setting. So, having defined the problem, we're really now focused on the present. We're literally just going to build an agenda. What are the topics that we need to discuss? And the question you want to ask yourself to make sure your agenda is complete is, if all these topics were resolved, would this problem be solved, or would this decision be made in a satisfactory way? And then finally, once you've identified your agenda, we move only then into solution generation, which is focused on the future. And what that does is it takes each individual topic and topic by topic, we brainstorm all the possible solutions. Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about each of these in a little bit more depth. So the goal of sense making is first and foremost to establish rapport. Of course, to get people comfortable with the process, you want to get everybody started, get the conversation rolling. But more than anything, the goal of sense making is to find out what all the parties in the decision, whether it's a negotiation, whether it's conflict resolution, whether it's just creative process, what everybody wants. What are their needs? What are their interests? What are their values? What are their goals? What are they trying to get out of this situation? You want to identify everything that everybody wants. And then you want to, of course, also identify all the topics or issues that are on their mind. So ideally, and you're taking notes, as I mentioned, throughout this whole process. And ideally, what you end up with by the end is a list. So you can make a big grid with people along the top and interests along the side. And for each person, and I'm sorry, topics or issues along the side. And for each person, you're identifying what are their interests or needs for that particular topic, which is, of course, exactly what we're doing with our planning document when we're engaging in our own preparation and in perspective taking. But now you're doing this actively to capture and record what's going on. This is also really useful as a framework for knowing, when are you done sense making? How do you know when you're ready to move on to agenda setting and brainstorming? Well, when you can give a thorough list of topics, and when you can tell what everybody's interests are, you're good to go. When you basically filled out that grid. And one sign of this is that people start to repeat themselves, but in a very calm way. So things that they were maybe upset about earlier, very passionate earlier, they're repeating as more of a matter of fact. Because I'm sure we've all had that experience where a conversation that can start off very uncomfortable or heated or uncertain, things that we're kind of dancing around, not quite comfortable saying. Once we've hashed it out and gotten it all out on the table, we become very much more comfortable with those terms. Okay, so that's a kind of super crash course in the sense making phase of decision making. And the tactics that you'll be using throughout that are primarily tools for building understanding. So structured communication and open-ended questions. So in the agenda setting phase, so focusing on the present, what are we going to talk about today? Your goal is to delineate the issues to be resolved. Of course, you literally need to create your agenda. You also want to ensure that you're using languages compatible with everybody at the table. So sometimes topics can be framed in a way that's somewhat controversial. So maybe one person wants to talk about cutbacks. Another person refuses to talk about cutbacks, but actually wants to keep everybody on hand. So here you might use some of that issue framing and say, person A, it sounds like affordability and minimizing costs is really important to you. Person B, it sounds like, respecting people's tenure and maintaining the workforce is important to you. So is personnel something that you'd like to talk about? So finding that way of framing the topic that is itself neutral and doesn't prioritize any one person's needs or interests. And then finally, during the agenda setting process, you may want to consider possible contingencies or issues that should be bundled together. And I just want to acknowledge at this time that making a topics list or an agenda is not easy. It's not always easy to distinguish a topic from an interest. It's not always easy to distinguish a topic from a solution or even a piece of advice, right? It's not always easy to tell when something should be broken into two topics. So to go back to our orange example, should you have talked about the rind and the fruit separately, or should you have combined them, right? When you talk about things separately, it can make it harder to find integrative solutions if you tackle them one at a time, because individual issues can be integrative. But if you talk about things together, it can also sometimes be hard to find integrative solutions because you may be missing divergences in what people really want out of that. So there's not a hard and fast rule about when to bundle issues. I just mentioned this as something that you'll need to consider and think about. Okay, and then finally, for the solution generation stage, your goal, of course, is to generate possible solutions. Um, and you want to use those needs and interests that you've heard of to promote creativity. So I already talked about examples of how you can ask people questions. What are some ideas that would get the needs and interests that you're looking for? Um, and then one of the real goals of the way I run this, not everybody does this, but the way I run solution generation in an ideal situation, this does take more time, is to separate idea evaluation from idea generation. And the reason we do that is to mitigate status ficing. And status ficing is the tendency for people to settle on the first acceptable option, right? Which is acceptable. But we don't want to settle for the first acceptable option. We want to optimize or find the best possible option. So, an ideal brainstorm will run through all of the topics, generate as many ideas as you can think of. And then, when people are out of ideas, push them to generate even more ideas. And only once you've thoroughly exhausted the idea space um, do you actually come back to try to select which ones that you want. And in my experience in mediation, when we have the time to run these full brainstorms, which we don't often, particularly when I'm mediating in a court context, we usually only get about 45 minutes for the whole thing. We often find that the solutions people end up agreeing on, they come from the end of the list. They're the ones that they came up with after they thought they already ran out of ideas. So the goal of solution generation is to push people to be as creative as possible. Now, I just want to acknowledge this was a whirlwind overview, a brief summary of one way of approaching decision making. It's my general rule. It's not going to be the right thing in every circumstance, but it provides a framework that hopefully you can adapt to improve the quality of the decisions you make in the future. And this concludes the lecture, The Three Phases of Decision Making.